we thought the project was over. Just we would lose the trust of the public, and they were skeptical to begin with. We stuck together.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and following an episode we did not so long ago about the great restoration of the Klamath River in California, and maybe the largest dam removal in America's history. 4 massive dams at great cost were brought down and the river's been transformed. I had a message from someone who listens to the podcast in the United States who didn't leave their name, but I'm very grateful to them for suggesting that we invite Frank Dituri and Brett Fessel on to talk about the Boardman-Ottaway River, which flows through the Grand Traverse region of Michigan. That river has undergone a massive transformation through a series of dam removals. It's certainly the largest river restoration project in the history of Michigan. And the natural flow of the river has been restored, and we all know how dam removal is one of the most miraculous things you can do to revitalize rivers and nature as a whole. So Frank and Brett, I reached out to you, and I'm really grateful that you got back to me and agreed to join me on the podcast. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Our pleasure.
Yeah, very welcome. Thank you.
So Frank, Brett, how long have you guys known each other, and how did you come to be working together on this extraordinary project in Michigan?
Well, I've been working for the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians for almost 3 decades now, and about 2/3 of the way through that career, became involved in the Boardman-Ottaway Restoration Project. And at the time, I was working full-time in a different role, happened to be pretty successful in writing grants, and so supplementing this project, and quickly learned that, I was not going to be able to pull this off myself. Every big project takes a village, so I'd secured some funding to hire a project manager, and that's when I met Frank. And I'll never forget the interview with him when he came in, and he was wearing this tweed kind of stylish jacket and stuff, and just kind of come out of the past. And I chatted with him a minute, and he shared, and I'm like, this is the guy, man. This is the guy. He's got a good background in survey and engineering and people skills. And so what was that, Frank? That was
2010.
So Frank, what's your background? How did you come to be the project manager for this project?
So part of what Brett alludes to, but we'll get to when we talk about the history of the project, was from the 2005 to 2009-10, there was a committee that was formed to make a decision about whether or not to have a project. Once the decision was made to have that project move forward, so the entities that were responsible for the resource, and we'll talk about that later too, made a decision to do this project, it hit at exactly the same time that the senator from Michigan at the time had really pushed hard through the Environmental Protection Agency and the federal government to secure funding for the Great Lakes. They realized, right at that time, they were realizing the value of fresh water on the planet. We have 32% of it right here in the Great Lakes region, and they decided that a bipartisan support was going to fund what was called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, GLRI. And through that, those dollars came the ability for folks to apply for grants that Brett was just talking about, and specifically through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? It's a separate entity within the U.S. government. And through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Brett had written some grants to be able to fund me. So he hired me, and I am a product of the GLRI. The whole Boardman-Ottaway Restoration Project is a product of folks thinking enough ahead about fresh water, caring for the Great Lakes and fresh water, to do something about it. So I met Brett in 2009 for the interview in 2010. It took us a couple of years to get the project off the ground.
So historically, the river was known as the Ottaway River, which was the Native American name, and then it was renamed after Captain Horace Boardman in the mid-19th century, and now today we know it as the Boardman-Ottaway River. And my understanding, having looked into this a little bit, is that there were 5 dams built along the main course of the river between, say, the late 19th century, the early 20th century, for hydroelectric power and so on. So presumably the river flows across the Grand Traverse region and into the Great Lakes. And so fixing those dams is that's why it's part of the Great Lakes Restoration Project. But didn't the communities in Michigan need those dams? Like, how did it come about that it was decided to remove them when these things were producing water and hydroelectric power and amenity and all those other things? How did society as a whole come to that decision that we must get rid of them?
To start, these dams were better than a century old. So, design life typically on dams is 70 to 100 years old. Hydropower dams are regulated through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and FERC. FERC issues licenses to produce power using hydro dams, and those licenses typically have a duration of 30 to 40 years. So in about 2005, the FERC licenses for 3 of these dams had expired. And when those licenses expired, there's a long process of engineering evaluation, safety, and so on in order to relicense dams. And oftentimes with old infrastructure like this, they find deficiencies in the structure. So essentially, that's what happened is going through the relicensing process, they discovered that there were going to have to be a number of upgrades made to the emergency spillways and other features of the dams that would, number one, cost a lot of money to the owners. And that funding typically isn't available through grants or otherwise to restore dams. These dams, when they were built, they were producing power for the community of Traverse City when it was small and growing. So at the time, that was adequate, and served the purposes of, powering mills and so on. Well, as the community grew, Traverse City grew, those dams weren't producing the lion's share of the power that were required for the city. So couple that with the fact that they're outdated and we're going to cost millions of dollars to renovate in order to get back online and produce a meager amount of power. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources essentially came to Grand Traverse Band with the notion of, hey, the city owners of these dams is going to be dealing with what to do with them, don't have the money to refit them. We can come to the table. The plan was to come to the table with funding for restoration. And that was the sort of the trigger point of making that decision, economics.
So what I've learned of the giant dam removals on the Klamath River in California is that 2 principal factors were totemic. The first was that these dams were no longer economically viable, which is the story you've just told me regarding the 4 dams on the Boardman-Ottaway. And the second was the century-long pressure by Native Americans in that part of California to have their salmon back. Their way of life, their culture, their spiritual connection with the natural world had all revolved around these massive runs of salmon up the Klamath, which had been maybe the most important or one of the most important salmon rivers on the West Coast. So can you tell me a bit about the relationship of the local Native American communities in Michigan with their river, Brett? This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
Yeah, so I think the namesake of this river being the Boardman from the 1840s is telling. When Boardman came in, logged the landscape, and within 4 years, essentially left the community and left his namesake on the river. And all the while, the Anishinaabe here in the Great Lakes, we're using that river. We're using the bay. We're using the watershed for traditional purposes, for hunting, fishing, traveling. But that information, those stories have been kind of lost to the wind upon colonization here, in Traverse City. It's a very popular tourist town, so it attracted a lot of wealth and people. The tribal people here, to a large extent, had been removed during the 1800s for acquisition of land. So that connection to the resource was all but severed. So compared, I guess, thinking about the Klamath, that connection to the river and to those fisheries remained intact. And so that was that thread of energy, I think, that brought, that groundswell of purpose towards the removal of the dams. It didn't exist to that extent here. So a lot of the impetus behind reconnecting this river with the Great Lakes and reconnecting people, community to this river is the center pin of this project, and reconnecting community. When I say community, I'm talking about tribal community, non-tribal community, and in the case of the tribal community, kind of reinvigorating that cultural connection. Lake sturgeon, walleye, lake trout, whitefish, these are all species that have been excluded from this watershed for 150 years, and those are species that tribal communities have depended on for millennia.
Brett, can you describe for me the landscape of Grand Traverse region? The river flows through forest. What does it look like?
It's a heavily shaped by the glacial activity, first of all. So these basins were scoured by glaciers, moving material down from Canada, northern part of Michigan. And where we're situated, where the mouth of the Boardman is, that enters Grand Traverse Bay, is essentially the southern extent of those glaciers. So that's what formed these enormous moraines or linear strips of sand and gravel that then formed flowways for the river, that Paleo River, if you will, has shaped this landscape here. The other features, the processes that have shaped the landscape here that you would see visibly are dunes, windswept sand accumulations coming in from Lake Michigan. So you have this very undulating surface that shifts and shifted around a lot. And so, as it turns out, the Boardman-Ottaway River once flowed to the west into Lake Michigan proper, and when the glaciers receded, deposited a large amount of material on that west side of Leelanau County, redirected the river then to the north into Grand Traverse Bay. So it's a very dynamic system.
And the ecology is forests or plains, or what's the vegetation like? Or what's the wildlife?
Northern hardwood forest, so beech, maple, ash, the forest communities. We have coniferous, white cedar, hemlock, so northern temperate forest. And the key, I guess, feature that is most important to fisheries in particular are due to that geology, due to the glacial geology, sand and gravel at a tremendous capacity for groundwater. So the ground, surface water comes, percolates down through that sand and gravel matrix, filters, and then emerges elsewhere when they hit impermeable surfaces and emerges in these rivers and streams at 45 degrees constantly year-round, super high quality, high DO. So it's an extraordinary opportunity and habitat for species like trout and cold water species.
Frank, can you please explain to me why are dams so catastrophic for river ecology, and especially on this river?
I can start by saying there's many studies, and the American Rivers studies that was done recently said that your best bang for your environmental buck, if you were going to spend it anywhere across your landscape, is in dam removal, because there are so many interconnected webs of ecological processes that benefit from the removal of dams. We can pin it down specifically to fish species, but there's a lot more going on, right? When you think about rivers, they're moving aquatic organisms both up and downstream. They're moving woody debris and sand and sediments and such, and they're moving water. And again, I think a lot of folks realize that rivers are not a one-dimensional thing. They actually move both ways through them. So after Brett had hired me, we went through several years where every year we would write grants for this project. And we had to support those grants with information that justified the request. And we kept targeting very linear, measurable objectives like miles of river, acres of wetland, because we couldn't possibly quantify all the real ecological connections that benefit from this. Everything within the river and within the ecological reach of the river in the riparian corridor is benefited by the removal of the dams. And such so, to really get to answer your question, is segmented by dams. It segments the movement of sediment through a system. It precludes fishery movement. It basically changes the whole landscape of a river.
Yeah, I had a lady called Pau Fernandez Garrido from Dam Removal Europe on the podcast very early on, more than a year ago. And she described the catastrophic impacts of dams in Spain. I mean, Spain is the most dammed up country in Europe, and they've had like a 99% decrease in eel populations. Migratory fish have more or less disappeared from Spanish rivers. But you also have all kinds of problems that I hadn't thought about. Like, for example, the loss of sediment flowing down the river means that Spain is losing its beaches. They're having to dredge sand from places and move them into where the tourists go in order to prop up those beaches. And you also have aquifer depletion because the sediment that rains down in these reservoirs behind the dams forms a concrete-like base, which is impermeable to water. So the water is no longer able to percolate through the substructure of the earth into those aquifers. So instead, you have above-ground reservoirs which evaporate at a very, very rapid rate, especially in summer. And so this idea that dams are the answer to all our problems, even the climate-friendly argument of hydroelectric power has low emissions starts to fall down if you consider the methane that emerges from the debris that is decomposing at the bottom of the dam reservoir. So I get it. And I think one of the great upsides of cheap solar, cheap wind, and the kind of power generation revolution that's happening in the world is that not only is coal becoming uneconomic, but actually dams are becoming uneconomic in the face of that competition. So do you think we're going to see a lot more dams come down in the United States? I mean, what's the dam removal movement like over there? You know, there's a bunch of reasons why this doesn't happen, but with poor economics in a place like the United States, it seems to me that the writing might be on the wall, and there could be a whole bunch more projects like yours.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point over this conundrum that we're in right now with climate change and the impacts of that, and seeking other sources of energy. And there is this common misconception of, well, dams, they aren't burning fossil fuels or, any of the bad things that we consider impacting the climate, but they're far from green, right? And for a lot of the reasons we spoke of. And we're learning more every day in terms of how important rivers are and the reach of impact in ecosystems that they have. Historically, we've thought that it's all localized. It's in the channel, maybe in the riparian area. There are interactions between organisms and communities that rely on the health of that river. But turns out, research has shown that it expands and transcends habitats all the way up into the wetlands or uplands of watersheds and so on. So to think that we're going to replace, a source of energy by disrupting that very complex system without impact, without consequence, is hubris in one way, but we didn't know what we didn't know at the time either. And we've learned a lot. So there are dams that, for what they do, contribute for power for communities and infrastructure. They're going to probably stay. And if they're designed appropriately, they're going to last. I think one of the things, too, that's going to trigger more dam removals, and I think this is driving more than anything, are these impacts or these changes in climate and weather that are creating more frequent storms, higher intensity, dumping more water on the landscape. These dams, a lot of the old dams were designed with 100-year flows or standards that are essentially outdated from a hydrologic standpoint. So we're going to continue to see higher, more and more pressure, hydrologic pressure on these systems. And as they're failing or as they're eroding, they're gonna fail, and we're gonna have impacts to communities, and that's where the rubber is going to meet the road. We can't tolerate losing lives, losing communities, and that's probably what's going to drive it. So to answer your question, I think it is going to increase. The challenge might be, how do we replace any energy that is being produced by them?
Brett, what about culturally? In this country, people don't like change in the landscape. So you can have a dead straight canalized river with a weir in the middle of it. And people like to walk along that towpath and truck some bread to the ducks. And it's how it's always been. And even such things as the danger to swimmers or people who fall out of boats and end up drowning at the bottom of weirs is often not enough to change communities' mind. The communities don't like these river restoration projects, re-meandering and dam removal and so on, until someone has really taken the time to explain it to them and made them fall in love with the idea. So how did you deal with that? The idea that communities just didn't want you to mess around with their dams?
Persistence, just steadfast persistence. The first dam that we removed at Brown Bridge, we had an issue with dewatering it. It failed. It sent a flood down the valley. And we thought the project was over. We would lose the trust of the public, and they were skeptical to begin with. We stuck together, and we learned from that. And we looked at the overall benefits and the temporary nature of the impact of that flood and explained that and brought the community along with that and tried to help people understand that you're much better off with a river that fluctuates naturally in the context of climate change than to have a 40-foot wall of water behind a dam that if it fails, you're going to have a really bad day. So just grinding through that, those adversities, it really made the difference, I feel. And the team that worked on this became like a family. We had each other's back. We supported each other in the tough times, because these things aren't easy. I can think of a number of pictures where the audience is filled with open mouths shouting, as we're sitting there listening, trying to help them along. So stick with it.
Frank, in 2012, 2013, the first dam came down, which was the Brown Bridge Dam, the furthest upstream. What happened after the removal of that dam in terms of recovery of nature? I mean, it must have been an incredibly exciting and satisfying moment for you when the dam came down, but even more so as nature came back to life afterwards. What did you observe?
Well, what was amazing, and I still remember the day Brett and I stood on the overlook on the north side of the river, and there were some community members, and we were all kind of looking at, it used to be an overlook of the impoundment, and now the river was flowing through there. And there were a couple of people there saying, look, they ruined it. They ruined it. It's a brown stump-strewn graveyard is the way it was reported in some of our media. What we were looking at was exactly what we envisioned happening after you remove the dam and you lower the impoundment by 20 some odd feet. Now you have the channel that remains and the tree stumps that were cut before. Anyway, we stood there and I remember Brett saying to the woman, give it a little while, come back in a couple of years and have a look. And what amazes me is that I go there bi-weekly, and in that stump-strewn graveyard after a few years, the seed bed that had been floating through that river for the past 90 years, depositing seeds in the silt at the bottom of the impoundment, was now exposed to energy and sunlight, and it was a virtual explosion. Within just 2 years, the poplar trees and the riparian vegetation was coming back. Now, people paddle through that section, and if they didn't know about the project, they would never know that anything happened there. There are poplar trees 30 feet high. There are active beaver colonies working on those in the river, and it's mind-boggling how much you can see that particular stretch of Brown Bridge, how quickly it's come back, and Mother Earth has ways to heal faster than we could ever imagine.
I don't know if you've seen the dramatic recovery of tens of thousands of hectares of riparian forest after the Russians, as part of their war effort, blew up that dam over the Dnipro in Ukraine, which was obviously an act of extraordinary violence and had terrible negative consequences in the short term for people that lived there. But as someone with an interest in nature and ecology, you can't help but notice that one of the largest recoveries of nature ever seen is currently unfolding in the mouth of the river Dnipro in the other side of the world from you. So next you had the Boardman Dam in 2017 with a new bridge, to accommodate the realigned river channel, and that further opened up the river. And then the Sabin Dam followed the following year in 2018. I mean, this must have been an unbelievably rewarding time for you, Brett, having worked on this for as long as you had. How much enjoyment did you get from watching these stretches of river come back to life after those dams came down?
Yeah, so extraordinary. Yeah, that's probably hardly gets to it. But I had the opportunity, because of one of the grants that we had received, required monitoring, basically prove it, right? Dam removal helped improve the habitat and function of the river, prove it. So we spent 4 years out there monitoring the channel, watching it evolve, looking at the particle sizes, the bed forms, the riparian habitat, the fisheries, the invertebrates, everything. And so to have the opportunity to watch that real time, firsthand, was incredible. I mean, it validated everything that I've learned and would teach to the general public about the resilience of river systems. They are incredibly resilient. I mean, I would argue that the earth, rivers, they're going to be fine without us, even if we're not here. It's what we do to them that causes the challenge. So watching that unfold was amazing. And it was the other piece to that stuck out in my mind is, again, how quickly it happened. You would think that decades to centuries of impact might take, an equal amount of time for things to recover, but it doesn't. It's literally moments. And so just costs money, so if we can come up with money, a lot of good can be done. So, and lastly, I'll say, again, it was certainly a large-scale, significant, historic dam removal, river restoration project. But I would say the underpinning foundation of all this was reconnecting the communities, winning the hearts and minds, helping people own the restoration, the whole community. And so holding that as a, celebratory movement has really helped bring the necessary attention to do the work. There's a lot of work that goes into, here we are 20 years, right, of restoration work, and we're still not done. And so that takes that persistence with the community as well.
And what next, Brett? You've got, the river's a long river, and the restoration of the Great Lakes is a long time in the making and a lot left to do. How many more dams are there on this particular river system and in the wider area that you live in that could come down?
Yeah, well, there's dozens, if not hundreds of dams that could come down within the region here. But focusing here, we have one dam left that is being replaced. That is the most important, if you will, dam. It's the lowermost barrier to access to this watershed from the Great Lakes at Union Street Dam, downtown Traverse City. And the goal is to refit or reconfigure that dam into a system that allows for the passage, the volitional passage of native species. We touched on that earlier about how salmon and Pacific salmonids, they can ascend ladders fairly easily. Great Lakes fish cannot. And so the idea is to create a system that allows for that reconnection, that reestablishment. And along with that, Grand Traverse Band, sort of to jumpstart things, are raising lake sturgeon that have been collected in another watershed, because we don't have lake sturgeon that run this river to much extent any longer. They've been basically excluded from the system. But we're also raising Arctic grayling, which have been extirpated from Michigan. So we're reintroducing grayling the genetics came from the Kenai River in Alaska, the state of Michigan, and 3 tribes are working on the Arctic grayling initiative to bring them back. So, next is to try and restore and just observe, the fish community come back. Typical trout streams in Michigan have 4 species: brown trout, brook trout, sculpin, maybe some darters. These rivers, pre-dam, pre-settlement, probably had dozens of species that occupied these systems that freely migrated back and forth from the Great Lakes. And those lowermost barriers have been in place, blocking that for generations of fisheries. So that's the vision here.
Brett and Frank, while I've got you both, and you're there in Michigan, a place I've never visited, but which I long to visit, I did read recently that a female cougar had raised cubs for the first time in Michigan in perhaps 100 years or 120 years. I'm involved in a campaign with Mighty Earth, an organization based in Washington, D.C., to restore cougars to the eastern side of America. And they're working in Vermont, Maine, upstate New York, and they hope to be able to get permission from state governments to deliver a restoration project. Maybe they'll come by themselves. So what's your view on the cougars of Michigan? Are they there? Are they there in any numbers?
You would ask a question like that. Predators and people are, it's a long-standing challenge. And in Michigan, cougars have not really been integral part of the landscape for quite some time, because we came in and we took care of what threatens us: wolves, cougars, these large predators. There have been moments in time back before the 90s where there was a large number of people that were keeping them as pets. Then a law came, you can't do that. Suddenly all these animals just disappeared. Cats, especially wild cats, make it just fine in the wild. So odds are there's been a lot of just releases of sort of not domesticated, but they were held as pets, and that's what a lot of people see. It wouldn't be a surprise to me that they found each other and started breeding. That may likely be the source of what people are seeing. Not to say that they aren't native here and wouldn't belong here, but it wasn't a deliberate restoration. And as you can imagine, the tension in the public over reintroducing large predators to a relatively high density region gives them a little consternation.
Yeah, well, we're having that discussion here in Great Britain at the moment around the possible reintroduction of Eurasian lynx, which is much smaller than a cougar. I mean, it goes to the forest, poses no threat to people, but instinctively it does give people the heebie-jeebies, and that's a whole discussion we're having. And some of us think that in due course we ought to be looking at European grey wolves in Britain. And we've got explosive populations of deer and a disequilibrium in the environment. Anyone who's been to the Highlands of Scotland or the Central Plateau of Wales will see what a landscape looks like 150, 200 years after you extirpate the main predators. In other words, treeless, and so well, that's an interesting side topic which we could talk about at length. But mostly, I just want to thank you both, Frank and Brett, not just for joining me on this podcast, but for this incredible project that you've brought about in Michigan. I really hope to visit you guys one day. And in the meantime, good luck with everything you're doing, and thank you.
Ben, thanks so much for reaching out. Getting the word out is so important.
Frank and Brett, against all the odds, have pulled off something truly amazing in Michigan. I hope to get out there one day and to see that liberated river flowing down into Lake Michigan. If you enjoyed this episode, please do give us a like or a share. Spread the word among your friends. It makes a huge difference. Next time, I'm going to be talking to an icon of Britain's rewilding movement, Mary Colwell. Mary is an author and a teacher and is inspiring the nation to get behind efforts to protect the threatened curlew, an extraordinary and mysterious bird that is disappearing from our shores. I do hope you'll join us.